Hello everyone and welcome back to the solutions lecture for the HTML Level 2 assessment. Let's get started by jumping straight to the editor. Alright, so here I have the editor and the course sign-up page opened. I'm just going to start straight from scratch, but remember this is what we're trying to recreate here with HTML. So the first thing we want to do is just call HTML, give this some sort of title, we'll just say course sign-up, and then let's start off with the body. So here we can see there's some sort of heading 1, and we will say course sign up page to match that. And then we have what appears to be a paragraph. You could have done heading 2 or heading 3, that's fine. And we'll say, please note, we'll say all text fields required just to save us some time. And then we start with the real business, which is the form. So I'll call the form right now, and we will remove class, action, and post. There was a bonus on the action, which we'll cover in just a little bit towards the end. But let's start off with the basic form. First thing you wanted to do is the inputs. So we have a first name input and a last name input. Let's grab those inputs. The first name is just a text input. It has no value, but it does have a placeholder. So let's put that in here. We'll put a placeholder in that says first name. And then let's just label this. We'll give it a label, and we'll say it's for FM, for first name, and we'll give the input an ID of FM. And then let's come back up here and give it the label first name colon. Alright, and we're going to do a very similar thing for the last name. So let's do that as well. Let's copy this and paste it. Let's make this last name. Let's come up here and change this to LM for last name. And it looks like I accidentally wrote M instead of N. So let's change those on both of these. LN and FN. It's first name, last name. And then the placeholder here, instead of first name, it's going to say last name. Alright, so far we have an extra T there. So far we have the first two inputs for the first name and the last name. Let's save this and make sure we're connected, make sure everything's working correctly. So I will delete that, hit enter, and it looks like we're good to go here. We have the course sign up page, all the text fields are required, first name and last name. So something to remember is that they're all required, which means I need to add one more parameter here in my input, which is just the required keyword. And I need to do the same thing here, required. And you can see that Adam is already ready to help me out. And you just need to, you could say it equals to true, but that's all I really need here. Okay, then up next, we want the email that we had earlier. So again, I will say input. This time, I'll say email, and I will give the placeholder, and let's just say the placeholder is user@gmail.com or something like that. Can't remember quite what it was, but we'll put in a label here, and we'll say this label is for let's say email, or let's call it mail, so we don't confuse it with the type, and give it an ID of mail. And then for the label, we will say email. And then finally, we also want a password. So again, I will make a label here. We'll say it's for pass. We'll call password there, and then create the input for it. Input, and you'll notice this becomes a lot faster when you're using Adam's really helpful autocomplete. So we will say password and no placeholder there. Let's save this and see what it looks like so far. And we're probably going to have to change something. Note that we have a bit of a basically no gap between first name, last name, email, and password. So one quick fix we can do that, since we don't know styling yet, is to just in between first name and last name, add some paragraph tags to insert another block there, and we can just keep them blank. So now when I refresh this, we get a little empty block there. Later on when we learn about CSS, we're going to learn how we can actually call styling for buffers and margins, etc. For right now, we can just use this little cheat. Okay, so we have all the text fields, and let's make sure we have them all required. So we still need to add those to the last two we just created. So required. And then down here, we also want to add in required. And you don't need to say equals in our case, we just can just say required there. Then up next, we want to get some radio buttons to ask if we're over the age of 18, yes or no. So let's put a paragraph in here saying, are you over 18? Question mark. We'll need 2 inputs, and they're both going to be radio. It's going to be an input. We'll call it radio. And remember, if we want them to be linked, they need to share the same name. So we'll call them both over, asking if they're over 18. And let's give them a label. So we'll say label for Y is yes, and then give the first one an ID of Y, and then so we can recognize it later, let's give it a value of yes. And let's give this one a value of no, and give it a label. And the reason for that is later on, whatever they select, I can reference the value there. So we'll put in a label here for N, give it an ID equal to N, and then here it's going to be no. So let's save that, make sure everything's working correctly for us. Are you over 18? Let's make sure they're linked together, and it looks like that's working just fine. All right, we can even expand this a little bit. And now let's check out the last thing we needed to do, which was a drop-down. Do you have a credit card or PayPal? So let's just say, do you have a card or PayPal? Question mark. And remember, the drop-down doesn't use an input tag. Instead, it uses a select tag. So we have select. We can give it a class, but we don't worry about that. We can also give it a name. Let's just give it a simple name. We'll say payment. And then finally, inside of this, we have the option tags. So option 1, we'll say this is a value of CC. And we'll give it the actual name on the HTML, credit card. Or excuse me, not really a name, but what it's actually going to display. And then the next option, value here, we'll say PP for PayPal, and then PayPal there. So let's save that, make sure it's working when I refresh this. Do you have a credit card or PayPal? And here we can select them. Perfect. And when I actually click submit, I'll get back a value, either CC or PP for payment. Okie dokes. Finally, let's use that paragraph trick again and input the submit button. So input, submit, and the value we'll give it is sign up. And let's save this. And let's confirm that it all worked. We'll refresh this. We'll put in a first name, put in a last name, put in some email. It's just made up. And then some password, over 18, credit card, sign up. It should just basically refresh the page. And if we look over here on the URL, if I expand this, I see the options that I wanted. Perfect. All right. So what we can do now is to expand on this, you could add values. So you could give password a value and email a value if you want them to show up here in the URL after clicking submit. But that doesn't help us too much right now because we don't know how to use stuff on the back end to actually grab those values. So we'll leave it there for now. What I want to address is the actual bonus question, which was, how can you make this sign up link to another page or another HTML file? And remember, we can do that through an action. So I will call action here. And what I will do is I will create, if I bring back my directory with control or command \, I'll create a new file here and we'll say thank you.html. And here it's just going to be an HTML file with one heading saying thank you. We will save that. And then the action is going to take us to that thank you.html. And the method will be get. Save that. So it looks really similar to what we showed earlier when we actually linked it to the Facebook page, but instead now the action is linking to a local HTML. And make sure it's in the same directory, that we don't have to pass in the whole file path. You just pass in thank you.html. So I will save that, refresh this, and let me make sure I refresh that correctly. Hit enter. Okay, course sign up page. Let's zoom out a little bit so it's still okay. I'll put in the same information as last time, Portilla, some made up email address, made up password, over 18, credit card, sign up, and it takes us to the thank you page. Hopefully you're able to figure out that bonus as well. But what I really want you to see is now we're actually ready to almost level up to understanding how we can link pages together. And that's going to be a really big part of creating a web application, how pages link to each other, and how your whole web application is designed to interact within itself. All right, so let's just quickly review everything we just did by grabbing this guy and expanding it. So what we had to do is created that heading 1, just a paragraph. We had the form, and if you did the bonus, you wanted to select action and method to some other HTML page you had, or if you wanted to just another website. Remember, for the website, you need to pass in HTTPS, etc. Otherwise, it'll start looking in the local namespace, which means on your computer. Then we wanted to use labels. We had the input for these texts. Remember, we had to make sure they were all required. We had the first name, last name, have the placeholders, make sure they're required. This little trick for the paragraph. Don't worry if you didn't get that yet. You won't need it later on when we actually learn about CSS. So if you were having difficulty with that, don't sweat it. It's kind of a trick. Then coming up next, we had to have this email label, password. Again, it was required. Are you over 18? Big trick here is when you're dealing with radio buttons and you want them to be linked together, make sure they have the same name. In this case, it was over and over. And assigning values to the text fields wasn't really necessary for our use case, but obviously you will have to assign values to them when we're dealing with a full web application. So keep that in mind. Then finally, we had this drop-down menu of card or PayPal, and that's the select tag with the option tag. And then we had the submit button. Okay, hope you enjoyed that assessment exercise, and you basically know enough HTML now to continue on with the rest of the course. Thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next section.